climate and ecological crisis just feel too massive to deal with sometimes. When it all feels so overwhelming, it can be tempting to tap out completely and disengage. That's totally understandable. However, my guest today, Beedy Parker, shows us that it is entirely possible to participate in climate-related activism and action whilst continuing to lead a happy and exciting life. From attempting to influence legislation to hemming our neighbours' trousers, Beedy has been getting stuck in since 1970. Sadly, we can't all be Beedy, but we can all take heart and inspiration from her example. So stick around a few minutes for that because you're really going to want to hear this one. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sow more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 15 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello, lovely one. How's your day going? Maybe it's only just started and you're listening to this on your morning commute. In which case, I hope you have an awesome day ahead and thanks for letting me accompany you as you get going. I'm going to skip any updates about me and my sustainability wins or fails because I want to give you an update related to last week's episode. So I've received some responses to last week's episode with Gina Wigger and have some great suggestions for solving the mending dilemmas faced by some of the lovely patrons. If you recall, Gina and I did our best to advise on a number of topics and we requested some comments from listeners and you came through, so thank you. So in response to Jennifer's question about repairing holes in merino knit, both Mary Morton, who is Edinburgh Street Stitches on Instagram, and Helena_cat on Instagram, suggested that needle felting would be a great option for this. Helena added that it's easier and faster than darning and can look virtually invisible or be a very creative statement. I'm guessing depending on the colour of yarn that you're felting to cover the hole. So thank you both so much. I haven't tried needle felting myself, but I do know that there is an excellent section on it in Erin Lewis Fitzgerald's book, Modern Mending. And that includes how you can harvest fluff from the rest of the garment so that your mend is actually invisible. And then there was a couple of responses to Andrea's dilemma involving their leather gardening gloves with a couple of fingers that require repair. So Alla, who contacted me via Instagram, told me about a product that she's heard about called a glove thimble. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes, but it's basically a separate leather finger that you pop over the glove on the finger with the hole in. Plus, I received an email from Kathy saying, I go through leather gloves a few times per year and I cut the thumbs out of old pairs as they're always near perfect. And once I've worn through the index finger on the new gloves, I slide the previous cut thumb over the index finger and then slide the glove on. The cut thumbs end up staying inside the gloves and you get a few more months out of the gloves. They don't even require sewing. So kind of a similar solution to the glove thimble, both of which sound easier than our suggestion to attempt to unpick the glove and patch or replace the finger. Thanks again for your responses. Whilst I'm in the thanking frame of mind, I want to take this opportunity to say huge thanks to Ina, Hayley, Shelley and Donna, all of whom signed up to support the podcast with monthly donations over the past week. Much appreciated. So I hope that all of you new patrons will consider joining one of the monthly mending meetups that I host for patrons, which take place via Zoom. And I hope you enjoy the community chat spaces available through the Patreon app and the website. Both the community chats and the meetups are such a lovely place to connect with other patrons and be inspired, ask questions and feel supported. You can become a patron for any amount that makes sense to you. Unlike many other creators on Patreon, I don't have preset tiers that may or may not work for you. You can access everything for as little as £1 or dollar or euro or any other currency per month. So please find the link in the show notes on the podcast app right now or visit the website checkyourthread.com and find the Patreon tab at the top. Okay, on to this week's episode. As I teased in last week's intro, this is the unofficial fifth part of the recent mending mini-series because it is a topic that gets touched on from a really interesting perspective in this conversation also. You might be wondering how I got introduced to Beedy. Well, it's all thanks to Check Your Thread listener and community member Kristen. Kristen happens to be Beedy's step-granddaughter and messaged me suggesting Beedy is someone I want to talk to for the podcast. So massive thanks, Kristen. I'm so glad you sent me that email. I know I often say this, but I'm so happy to be putting this conversation out into the world because Beedy is a true source of inspiration. I have so many personal takeaways from talking to Beedy. One of them is this. If you are blessed with a long life, then there will be different phases, and you will want to and be able to engage in different things during each of those different phases. It's okay to not do everything all of the time. We all just need to pick an aspect that we want to focus on that will hopefully improve the world. Right now, I'm in a phase where my main form of activism is creating this podcast. That's what I can and want to do right now. And thanks to the help of the awesome, lovely patrons, I am able to do it. Any extra things that I can achieve on top of that is awesome, but my main priority is to try and make the world a better place through this podcast. For my mum, Jean is volunteering once a week at her local food bank. She collects unsold and donated food from a local supermarket and then helps at a local distribution hub to process the donations so they can be sent out to individuals and families who are struggling. That is what my mum wants and is able to do to make the world better. So I really want you to hear this conversation with Beedy and find it as a source of inspiration. Please don't listen to it and think, oh, I can never be like her and do everything that she's done. You don't need to. Just pick one thing. And if that becomes easy, or more time and brain space becomes available to you, then you can work in another area also. Right, unless you are driving or handling heavy machinery, please visit the show notes on the website checkyourthread.com, because you will see some lovely photos that Beedy sent me of the things that she makes that we talked about in the episode. And you'll find a couple of links to stuff that you can read about and by Beedy, and a complete article that Beedy wrote advocating for wool fibres. So until next week, take care of yourself, have a think about what your one thing is, and enjoy! Fantastic. So welcome to the podcast, Beedy. So nice for you to come here, and thank you so much for some of your time today.
Well, thank you for your time, and also your podcasts are so fascinating.
Oh, I'm glad that you've had a chance to listen to some of it. I would really be very grateful if you could introduce yourself by telling us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days.
I'm Beedy Parker, and I'm in Camden, Maine, which is right up along the coast, almost at the top of, before you get to Canada. And I didn't hear the end of the question. So.
Oh, how you fill your days?
Oh, it was too much. My husband died a while ago, and I'm on my own, but I have a very nice family, fairly near. And I'm 84 years old, so I'm sort of aging in place, they say. But in the meantime, I just try to keep up with everything, which involves gardening. And, well, the reason I'm talking to you is because I enjoy mending, and it's been important to me for a long time. So
yeah, I can't wait to get into all of that. So I know that you identify as an environmental activist.
Yeah.
And from a couple of articles that Kristen has sent me, one that was written by you and one that was written about you, it's clear that you've got loads of dimensions to your interests and your activism. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I made the mistake when I was in college of signing up for general education, and I've been a generalist ever since, which means having one's attention in many places at the same time.
So where do you think your origins of your environmental sensibilities have come from? Like, was it a mindset that was modelled to you, or was it a reaction to your own experiences?
Well, I think it was both, and it just grew, and I think it's still growing, which is kind of ominous. I thought the environment was coming along beautifully, and I just enjoyed it, I mean, we always lived in cities, so, it was more like a garden and trees out in the street. And, I only just remember this. I was brought up believing in fairies. And
really?
Fairies were very much how I learned about nature. It was sort of a Victorian way of thinking and teaching children, but I was super enthusiastic about fairies.
I bet.
They sort of connect with flowers and insects and plants. I think that's where it came from.
So when did you start to think of yourself as an activist, or when did you first realise that you were an activist?
Oh, gosh, I think I was always a busybody. I was working for the Children's Museum in Boston, helping the developers who were making beautiful exhibits to teach children. And Earth Day came along. I'd already been active about clean air because I thought, well, I have asthma. It's important that the air be clean. So, and then all of a sudden, everybody was trying to do things to fix all the problems. And I just plunged in. So that was 1970, and I was just 30 years old. We moved from the Boston area to middle of the country to Illinois, and I joined a women's group there. Women were just beginning to go to work and go back to school, but they were still powerful in the home, and they were still powerful about, protecting everybody. It was housewives involved in pollution solution, and it was wonderful. It was in a college town, so there are people, but the women hadn't gone back to work yet. And we just started working on everything in front of us. And that was the beginning.
Right. Well, what did that look like? What activities did that include?
Well, it involved legislation, for one thing. It involved trying to get people to ride bicycles, which they already did in this town, so we just tried to make it better. The trees were being planted a lot. We'd lost the elm trees. That was a terrible thing that happened in the U.S. A lot of the street trees were elm trees. So there was tree planting, and there was a friend and I set up something called an Environmental Awareness Center, which was for teaching teachers how to teach the environment, which I loved it, but we left after a year, so I couldn't go on doing it. What else did we do?
So at this point, did you have children of your own?
I did.
How did you find the time to set up and be involved in all these things, and you've got children as well?
My older children, I had 2 children in my early 20s, and they were in school. And then I had a second marriage, so I had a baby in the middle of this. And that made me sit back, but my husband was very supportive, and eventually it turned into households for pollution solutions, and all the men joined, but for a while it was just the women. Actually, activism can work quite well with if you're a stay-at-home mother, and at that point I didn't have a job, so there was time. But then the women's movement, which I also was enthusiastic about, people started going back to school, and they didn't have as much time. Yeah. And then they had jobs, and then now there are lots of women who are lawyers and doctors, and they do a different kind of work in their jobs, which can be quite environmental too.
Yeah, I think a lot about how having children can be, in some ways, it kind of is a boost, isn't it, towards thinking about the future, thinking about the environment, thinking about the health of our earth. But in other ways as well, they take so much time and energy and bandwidth that otherwise,
My family was supportive, but now that I look back, I think that I didn't pay enough attention to my children. But I think that was more my personality. I sort of believed that children got born and then they just kind of kept going, and I would provide lots of things for them to do, but I don't think I always listened very well. But that's probably more because I'm just not like that.
Interesting. Have your children got a kind of a heightened awareness around environmental, issues today?
Yeah, they are. They're wonderful. They're not usually activists, although they've had periods of activism. They care a great deal, I admire what they do, but they're not quite as crazy as I am.
Well, it sounds like you've done. I'm kind of struggling to know where even to kind of really get into all the things that you've been doing. So let's start there. So you were a part of this households for. Did you say it was for clean air?
Housewives.
Was that the name?
We weren't ashamed.
Sorry,
of
housewives.
Being housewives for pollution solutions, and that reads as HIPS, hips, and so we had this sort of feeling of power. We had hips, and we could bump people aside and achieve what we wanted.
I love that. I love that. But then you said you moved on. You moved elsewhere after a short time.
Yeah, my husband wanted to be near both the sea and mountains, and he'd summered in Maine, so we moved to Maine. And he helped with the activism. I remember we gave an anti-nuclear debate just before we left, and he was teaching a sort of volunteer class with a physicist that was to do with energy and saving energy and energy's problems. So, and then we came here, and it's a good place to live for caring about the environment. A lot of other people do too.
Right, so it didn't take you long to find a new community of people who had the similar interest.
Right. And we set up a household which was as energy saving as we possibly could. And, gardening and, I don't know, people, well, they still aren't hanging out the wash. They use dryers a lot. But, all these things that you can do in your household.
Yeah.
Which help in the long run.
Absolutely. So where were you finding your inspiration and where were you sharing ideas for the different things? Because it sounds like you're doing things both on a home level
yes.
and kind of broader political, societal level. You're trying to implement policy change.
Yes, very much. Well, I found an organization called MOFGA, which is Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And we were very motivated because in central Illinois, where we'd been living, we were in the midst of the industrial agricultural world where there were great tanks of pesticides outside the town and tanks of fertilizer. And the rivers were straightened. It was just corn and soy, the richest land in the world, probably. At least they said so, getting washed away. So we were poised for this organic farming and gardening movement. And there was a newspaper, and I'd be in touch with the editor and put things in it. And, we had chapters for teaching ourselves about the whole situation. And we started a legislative committee for the organization and started going to the Capitol in Augusta and trying to get legislation passed. And I was watching the Board of Pesticide Control for years and writing notes about what they didn't do. We used to call it the Board of Pesticide Protection.
Right, so you're looking at this, in a state level, a national level, and in your own garden.
Right. Well, see, I'd lived in all these other countries as a child, so I knew what was happening in the other countries. A lot of poverty, actually, because of the rich people sort of controlling things, but also the damage that was being done. I learned about that later, about all the environmental damage being done in other countries in a sort of post-colonial way. So I had that mission in my head also.
Right. How did that awareness of the poverty and the impacts on other countries, how did that inform what you were doing?
There was a movement. The marketing people called it free trade, which meant that you didn't have regulations. And the environmental people and the social people, let's see, how did we frame it? It was, I guess, partly we were talking for fair trade. In other words, you didn't exploit, the other countries, and you had regulations, and you didn't toss people off their land, the small farmers. And I just felt that the people who we called poor in other countries were actually living a more environmental life than we were in this country. So it was sort of, the messages were going the wrong way.
So where did you see that? I know that you spent some time in Peru, for example.
Well, I was a child in Argentina, so I sort of observed dictatorship from a safe distance. And then after I finished college, which I did go to in the United States, my first husband and he found a job in Peru up in the mountains. I was taking pictures of satellites, and it probably was for how to throw missiles in a, more efficiently, but we didn't know that. We thought it was just astronomical. And so I observed how people live there. And then I lived in Argentina again, had a baby there, and then we lived in southern Spain, and I had a baby there. So I was dropping babies in different parts of the world.
I can't even imagine how much of a challenge that is, having tiny children in these different, whilst you're moving around the world.
I can tell you, people help each other taking care of children. It's much easier because everybody wants to hold your baby.
Yeah, I think that's something that, we're going to come on a little bit later to kind of talking about some of the similarities and parallels between activities in the 70s and nowadays. But I think that having a more communal mindset around childcare is something that we've lost. Would you agree? Or certainly in the Western cultures.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I really do agree.
Yeah, I think that it can be really isolating sometimes now. And I think that's why I was kind of, talking about, like, I can't believe you had the time. It's like, well, if you had someone who was willing to look after your kids for a couple of hours.
Everybody wanted to help.
Yeah.
And the children were running around and entertaining each other. And
yeah.
But in the meantime, living in these different places, I needed to sew and I needed to mend because you couldn't go out and buy things.
Right.
You could buy cloth, but you couldn't buy anything else. So since I love making things, I remember when school started, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be in these schools for years and years and years, and I'm not going to have any time to do what I want to do. So it was very liberating to go to these different places and be able to make things.
So you suddenly found yourself, you had some time to make things.
Yeah, there were always some women who worked. They certainly did, but I wasn't supposed to.
Interesting. Why do you say you weren't supposed to?
Well, if you live in another country and you're not terribly poor, you're supposed to be at home. It's just kind of the custom, although a lot of women did work. There were women in the market cutting up meat, and there are women farming for sure. The women always worked. If there were farms, women taking care of the animals,
Yeah.
So I think it was a class thing as well.
Sure. So as a woman who was coming from a different country, that role for you was different. Yeah, I see that. So you had a chance to sew. So when did you start sewing? How did you learn to sew? Is that something in your family?
Well, I think I mentioned when we wrote to each other, I went to a French school in Belgium when I was a teenager, and we had sewing. And I think the Americans do too. They used to. And it's quite good. And I was terrible at it. I just couldn't do anything straight. And I've never been very straight, but I love making things. And they taught us how to make patterns for our bodies to fit ourselves.
So you did that at school?
Yeah, you could make anything by altering the pattern. It was just amazing. So I always had that. I could still probably make them, except I don't see very well now. So
right. So, wow, that's an amazing education right from the beginning then, and that served you going forward.
Well, let me tell you, my second husband was great at finding us books, and he found a British book called The Needleworker's Constant Companion. And it was all sort of 70s, bell bottoms and stuff. But
amazing.
It taught you how to make patterns. It taught you, it had patterns in it. It taught you all the needlework things you would ever want to know in a very simple way. Yeah, or jot it down. See if you can find a copy.
I will. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes as well.
And so we got one for each of our young daughters who loved making things. So we kind of used that book.
Fantastic. So you made sure you passed that knowledge on to your children as well.
They made things. They started making cushion toys, like little flat elephants and Humpty Dumptys and things when they were very little. And they never looked back.
So when you were moving around, did you always have a sewing machine with you?
Yeah, well, when I got married the first time, the family was very austere. We didn't like spending money. Nobody liked spending money. So I got married. I told my mother, I said, the only thing I want is a small sewing machine. And so she bought me one of those ones that quilters use now, a little Singer, mini Singer. It went with me everywhere. I could do so many things with it, and not because it was fancy, partly because it was simple.
Yeah. And you could move it around because it wasn't too hefty.
Yeah, and I learned to mend with it also.
So let's talk about mending.
Well, I got inspired with mending. I just took it for granted at first. Things got mended. I don't know who did it. But I remember being on board ship, and there was an old Scotsman. This was going from Montreal to Liverpool. And he was wearing this jacket, a beautiful tweed jacket. And he must have been in his 80s. He was going to visit his daughter in Scotland. And there were little men's all over his beautiful tweed jacket. Because everywhere a moth had eaten something, somebody had mended it. And I was just so tickled. And he was a charming old gentleman, probably the age I am now. And then in Peru, people made beautiful fabrics. And when they wore out, like if it was a beautiful fabric on the back of a donkey or a llama, if there was a hole, there would be a patch or a darn. So I just had this admiration for mending. Oh, I know, there was another thing, a school in Switzerland, and it wasn't that long after World War II, and the sheets would come back beautifully clean and smelling wonderful, and they would have little machine darns in them.
Right.
Where you put fabric in the machine and you hold it on either side and you lift off the pressure.
Yes, yeah.
And then you go round and round and round in circles you build up the fabric if it's a small hole. And for a sheet, you want it to be strong. I mean, you don't want a worn out sheet. You're going to do something different with a worn out sheet. And I was fascinated by those little circles, and then I learned how to do them. And that's, a very useful technique for very sturdy darning.
It sounds like you've discovered mending in the wild, as it were, like all over the place.
Yes, it was in the wild. It was a very wild.
And then you incorporated those techniques, learned to replicate those techniques yourself for your own clothing, your own textile items.
Yeah.
Am I right in believing that you had a mending and alterations business at some point?
Well, I did. When we first got here, we didn't have any money. Well, my husband got a teaching job, and I thought, well, what can I do? And my older children were going to school, and my youngest child really needed more kids around, and eventually we found a nursery school, which was great. But I wanted to make a little bit of money, and so I just advertised, and people would bring me, and it was all old people, old Mainers, and the men would bring me their trousers to hem up because they were losing some height too, and the women did the same thing. And I met these lovely people, and they appreciated, that I would mend their clothes. And a lot of the fabrics were nice, natural fabrics. After a while, it began to get more synthetic, and I didn't really like working with them as much because there was sort of a different rough feeling with your fingers. But of course I did, because they needed them to be hemmed or whatever else I was doing. Well, this is sort of a fun story. Using that darning technique with a machine, there's a place that makes warships in Bath, Maine, and
right.
He was doing all this welding with a welding thing, and the sparks fly out, and he was wearing his cloth armor, his overall thing was very heavy, and there were little holes, just like the gentleman's jacket that I admired so much, all over. And so I darned them with that sewing machine technique. He was tickled pink. Of course, he had little spots all over his overalls, but he knew that it was protecting his very heavy overalls that he wore. when he was doing this welding on the battleships.
So it sounds like by opening your home up for mending and alterations, it also gave you a connection with your new community as well.
It did. It was a wonderful way of sort of introducing ourselves to each other. Yeah.
And it sounds like that people had that real mentality that they wanted to keep their items in use for as long as possible.
Well, the older people did, and this is what I'm encountering now, is in myself, the sort of emotional desire to keep things, keep the same clothes, keep some of the things that belong to friends who have died or family members who have died. So it's I think the old Mainers, they had come from the Depression and from World War II, so they had it in them just because that's the way the culture was in the past.
Yeah.
Even before that, people weren't very wealthy around here, and a lot of them still are not. It's a pretty poor state. It's a very rural state.
Right.
And people do try to keep things and mend them, and they make quilts out of pieces, and you can still buy lovely old quilts that are made of all sorts of scraps and pieces of other people's clothing, but with embroidery on the edges. I don't know if you've seen those crazy quilts that they used to make. And they often would embroider little messages in the squares, too. So it's very, very nostalgic and emotional. And people make fun of sentiment and being sentimental, but I think it's important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's still an impulse that many people have, and tapping into a tradition that is existing and has existed for a long time and in lots of different places.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it fits very well with what's happening to us with the environment and worrying about climate change. I think that what we really have to do is cut back on consumption widely and live more like some of the people I admired in some of these countries I lived in. I know mostly people are afraid and they don't think they can do it, but I think we can. I think we can grow more food ourselves. I think we can mend things and keep them. And I think it'd be better for us.
Absolutely. I read a fantastic piece that you wrote about wool. Why do you feel that we should be incorporating more wool fibres into our wardrobes?
Well, lots of reasons. But what happened, I was going for a hike with friends, and they were all wearing this stuff that's called that plush stuff that you make.
Oh, like fleece.
Fleece. They call it fleece. Okay, they use the same word that you used for the sheep's wool.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that.
And all of a sudden, people who I knew who had been wearing beautiful Shetland sweaters, things that they knit, and we used to order wool from Canada, from New Brunswick, which wasn't so expensive, but it was strong. It was worsted. And anyway, they had always worn beautiful sweaters, home knit. And, the people sailing always wore them too, because when you wear wool, even if it gets wet, it's still warm.
Yes.
And the water's very cold here. Anyway, we were going on a little hike, and they were all wearing the fleece stuff made of synthetics. And I just felt sad. In MOFGA, in Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, there are people who have sheep, and they compete with their fleeces, and they spin the yarn, and they make beautiful yarn, and they knit like crazy. But I just felt like it was going to disappear. And I think when you have sheep, you need to be able to sell the meat as well as the yarn, as the fleece. It's double product, and now it's sort of expensive for people to have sheep, and the yarn is really expensive. It didn't used to be so expensive. So anyway, I thought something not right about this, and I had already had experience with synthetics and how. Oh, when I worked for an archaeologist, I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm going all over the place, and I am.
No, I love it.
We used to test the mummy wrappings, the beautiful Peruvian fabrics. And we'd take a little piece and then light a match. And if it smelled like animal burning, you knew it was wool, and if a horrible smell, sort of. If it smelled like wood burning, it was cotton.
Wow, that is amazing, because that's something that sewers are encouraged to do now, to do a burn test. But you were doing it on fabrics from mummies.
Yes, yeah. So, but then later I learned that if you burn synthetic, it turns into a horrible little black puddle. It's like magic, and it smells horrible.
Yeah, it really is plastic at that point, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm sure it's poison to breathe it too. So that was the basis of what I was writing, and I brought in the Wizard of Oz story because the witch melts into water, but those fleece things that people were wearing, if they burned, they would turn into horrible, smelly oil.
Absolutely.
Which is what they really are. And now you probably read about what's happening, what people are recognizing with the plastics, that it's just turning into smaller and smaller, tinier pieces, and now they're in us. They're all over the sea. They're in our food. They're in our babies. And each little piece of plastic, this is something a lot of people don't necessarily know yet, attracts other kinds of oil materials, some of which are more toxic than the plastic. Some of the plastics are toxic. So they have a coating of nasty stuff that they're carrying, and the smaller they get, the worse it is. And synthetic fabrics are made up of very fine plastic particles, fibers.
Yeah.
And so they break down into the smaller things even faster than all the big plastics. We haven't quite got there yet, but I hope we do. Because we will want to raise sheep, we will want to probably eat their meat as well, so that the farmer gets some profit. And we will want to grow cotton, even though cotton uses a lot of water and can be pretty bad in the growing. A lot of places it's very industrialized, and there are many, many other plants which produce fiber, which can be spun.
Absolutely.
And made into fabrics. And then we need to keep the fabrics and mend them and not throw them away.
Yes, exactly. It's like every fibre that we can wear has some drawbacks, but most of those drawbacks for the natural fibres are just related to the sheer volume that we're consuming, isn't it?
Yes, too much of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you wear a lot of wool yourself?
Yeah, I do. And my daughters and I have for years and years always shopped at secondhand stores where we find nice old sweaters and all sorts of things. And that, unfortunately, because the synthetics have made such an inroad into the culture, the secondhand stores, it's hard to find. You can find cotton, but finding wool is so hard.
Absolutely. So knitting was a big part of it's been a big...
Yeah, we all knit. And,
right.
And my husband would read to us all sorts of things, including fairy tales. So.
Whilst you were knitting?
Yeah, or mending.
Has knitting and mending often been a communal activity then?
Yeah. Well,
I love that.
I think we have some what's called attention deficit disorder in the family. It's jumpy minds, and we find that you can concentrate on what somebody is saying better. I remember reading about some children wanting to knit in school and being told they couldn't. But I thought, oh yes, of course, so they can listen to the teacher better.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if you have that in your family, but I think we do.
I understand, yeah. Not that as such, but that is definitely a tendency that I've heard of other people that I know, yeah, for sure, that they can concentrate better when they are doing something with their hands.
Yeah.
In fact, I was just reading an article recently about somebody who had a ADHD diagnosis, and they were a weaver, and when they were weaving, they often paired that activity with listening to an audiobook, because doing something with their hands meant that they could concentrate on the book better than if that was their sole activity. Yeah. So that's interesting that you came to the same conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I did have a period. of wanting to be a teacher, and I ended up doing some remedial teaching in the schools here, which was very rewarding. And I learned about some of the what's called learning disabilities and how they work. And I thought, oh my God, I have that. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I think when a lot of teachers or parents sometimes as well, isn't it, when they find that their children have some neurodivergence, that then they realise that, oh wait, I have that too, or that's something that is familiar to myself.
Yeah, it was very helpful.
So I would really love to talk a little bit more. We were talking back and forth before in our email about some of the similarities and the differences between activities like from the 70s in terms of activism and environmental awareness and today. And I had a question that something I've always wondered about, you know, the kind of environmental awareness and the activities going on in the 60s and 70s. Like, I was wondering, like, how widespread was it? Because I'm wondering how on the fringes or how mainstream those concerns were, because it seems like what came after, like in the 80s, was just a complete tidal wave of consumerism, and that's kind of never really retreated so much, has it? So, you know, how was it for you having that mindset and then, you know, it all kind of not washing away, but...
That is a very, very penetrating question, because I think you're describing what happened in the 70s. Some of us, and I've really got to say some of us, and I think it really was more people who had education and some money behind them. And then there was the Vietnam War, which actually took all the males in, and they got really distressed about what was happening to them, to be sent to Vietnam to, you know, just make a mess. I mean, it was very upsetting to everybody. Those things together, looking at what was happening with the environment, looking what happened in Vietnam, sort of produced a body of young people who wanted to stop. They wanted to stop. Some of them wanted to stop being industrialized. Some of them wanted to stop being part of a war machine. And it was a mix. And there was something called the Back to the Land movement, which really was not very widespread. And you're quite right to put your finger on that. But it was played up, and people who wrote or artists were very much part of it. So you heard about it.
Right.
But it wasn't big. There's still, most people, they told what to do, advertise on television. Television was huge. I remember when we started watching television, and my mother, who had sort of wanted to escape from being British because of the class system, she really wanted to be an American.
Yeah.
And so she would adopt things like TV dinners, and, you know, I was in college there, so I'd come home and we watched TV. This was in the late 50s. But everybody was still that way. And so it wasn't that hard for there to be a revolt against the Back to the Land movement and the peace movement and everything, because a lot of people just they'd had a hard time in the Depression with their parents they'd had a hard time in World War II, and they wanted some consumerism. So it sort of flipped, just as you observed. But in the 70s, we had the energy crisis, which was probably mostly the Middle East turning down the oil and turning up the price. But we also, a lot of us, and my husband was an economist, and he believed that we would get to the end of the oil and then we had to conserve. And I think we sort of knew that it was pretty poisonous too, but it was more saving energy that was motivating us. And we didn't like nuclear. Yeah, we were going full bore in the 70s, particularly in Maine, but in mostly college centers, I would say. And then our business communities, I shouldn't say business, but large scale, the big corporations, and they didn't like being regulated for environmental reasons.
They still don't.
You know, they put their money where their mouth was. And they got Reagan elected, and the whole thing just flipped. And it was hard to take. We had a wonderful food co-op because Maine being sort of at the end of the industrial food chain, and people still had gardens then, but they were just beginning not to in town. And so the new people wanted to buy good vegetables, and we actually did ordering from Boston. I mean, it wasn't very environmental, but it was very communal. And we had so many people. The islands out in the bay and up and down the coast in this enormous pre-order. And we ordered grains, and we learned how to cook with grains. We learned how to eat with less meat, and we learned how to do all these things that in the 50s you were supposed to stop doing because you're supposed to buy everything.
Sure.
And then by the middle of the 80s, the co-op dried up because now there were jobs, and now people's kids were bigger or they got too old. So a lot of our efforts, it seemed like it was just going to wash away. But the organic organization and the organic farming and gardening was still strong. So, we kept going, just kept going.
Yeah. So the organic aspect, you managed to keep that going. But obviously, since then, there's been the rise of fast fashion, for example. And as we were talking about how many synthetic fabrics are out now, it's like the majority of fabrics, the majority of clothing that is sold, or at least is produced, is synthetic fabrics now, isn't it? It's like kind of plastic-based ones. That must have been tough to kind of win.
I sort of tolerated it because I knew that it was strong stuff. And then because I followed toxics, because of where we lived in Illinois and what I saw there and what I knew, I always read environmental periodicals, and they covered the toxicity. And in Illinois, people were getting cancer from eating the fish in the ponds that the water drained into. And they didn't know, and it was great fat fish, delicious. And, it accumulated in their bodies, and I just learned more and more about the toxicity of a lot of our industrial process. So that was the basis of my keeping going, along with enjoying the gardening and having that kind of household where you kept things and mended them, and knowing people who felt the same way. We started early on, in order to keep this organization in enough money, we started something called the Common Ground Fair, which is this huge fair. And so we did exhibits there and lectures, and eventually I started a parade for the children, which is called the Vegetable Parade or the Children's Garden Parade, and it's still going, and all these costumes you dress as vegetables and animals, and a compost heap. We have a compost heap in our parade, and the children parade, and they say grow organic, and everyone belongs in the garden, and no pesticides on me, and things. They have signs they carry. So.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So do you feel like there's been a new wave of interest in...
Well, there definitely has been. There's a generation in between that is pretty much into buying. And there are young people. I'm afraid they're very afraid, which they should be, I guess, but I don't want them to be afraid. And they really want to do all the things that we wanted to do in the 70s. It's the same thing.
Yeah. What have you seen that's been going on today in terms of current endeavours or activities or individuals or groups that you've seen? What have you seen that's been inspiring you and giving you hope?
Well, we have a lot of young people who want to be small farmers, which makes me a little worried, because if you don't have some money to keep you going, you don't make a lot of money. Well, some people do, but we need to tell the small farmers that traditionally small farmers always had other work. Somebody would work out and do something, or you did different stuff in the winter. If we don't have winter anymore, we'll just have to have little extra jobs to keep going, because I do believe in small farms, and I do believe in, well, having gardens and, a productive homestead if you can. And I think people in cities can grow quite a lot of food, not enough to feed them, but, they need to try to, And community gardens, we've started several community gardens in town. And, I wish we still had MOFCA chapters, because we did a lot of teaching with our chapters. But I think now I'm belonging to a small group, and everybody's younger than me, thank God. And we're teaching about climate change, and all these things are part of the teaching about climate change, because they're the positive things. All these things you can do, and how communal they are, how you sort of engage people doing things together. And they're getting lonely with their computer screens, so, I think it's going to be good. It is frightening, but
it is.
I think there are a lot of things you can do good. I worry about the migrants. They've got to go somewhere if it gets too hot. So
yeah,
that's pretty scary, but it's already scary. So
absolutely. Is there anything that you've heard of going on to do with textiles that you're excited about?
Well, I'm very excited about my granddaughters and other young people's interest in, like yours, in natural textiles, and then growing fashion, actually, of mending. I'm trying to sign myself up for some presentations or, hands-on teaching mending, even though I can't see well enough to do it. But I've got all these artifacts of things that have been mended or things that have been made of rescued textiles. Like we make lovely slippers out of felted sweaters that people don't know how to wash wool here, so it all goes falling. And so we buy up the felted sweaters and we cut them into these slippers, and I put corduroy, which has lines on it, on the soles, so you actually can walk out on the ice in the winter. Not that you use them for going anywhere, but just going out and putting something in the compost. Yeah. You don't slide on them. I love them. And then with old denims and everything, any kind of pants that we wear out, I love making something I call pants bags, which are patchwork.
Tell me about pants bags.
And they're so fun, and people really like them, so I give them away.
So how do you make your pants bags?
Well, I just have a piece of paper on the floor. I cut up the old pants and save the good bits, and then sort of either use whole sections or cut patches as well. And I piece them together on my pattern rectangle on the floor and just sort of pin them down roughly and then pin them to each other. And then, I don't know, I sew the sections. And actually I made, after my husband died, he had all these ties. He didn't wear ties that much, but he did when he worked in the capital city, and he had a proper job sometimes. And I made this quilt out of all his ties, and it's beautiful, all these colors.
Amazing.
And we used to make tie skirts because people stopped wearing ties, but there are lots of ties going begging, and they twirl beautifully, if you're doing contra dancing or, folk dancing.
And they often pick up the light really nicely as well.
Some of them are shiny. Yeah, and they're different patterns. It's like patchwork quilts. So there's such fun things to make with all the bits and pieces that get left over.
I mean, it sounds like you, in your family, reuse, repurposing, mending has never disappeared. But I think for a lot of families, there's been a break, hasn't there, where maybe mending and keeping things for as long as possible was something that maybe they have a memory of their grandparents doing, possibly, but there's been a break. So we're trying to reclaim some skills and some knowledge,
Yeah, that's it. I guess I'm sort of a hoarder, but not, and things are all over, so I'm messy too, but I'm not I'm not. I'm kind of a careful hoarder. I have, a scrap basket, and I have collections of notions, lots of zippers, so I can always find whatever I need for a zipper, because I've got all these zippers I took out of the pants or whatever.
I love that. So all the scraps from garments that have worn through, and you've harvested like the bits that are okay still.
Yeah, an interesting bit of pattern, or something with a nice sheen or a beautiful color, and I always have everything I need.
So, I was thinking about the differences between the 70s and kind of now, and that gap that for many families they've had. And I was kind of thinking that one of the good things that we have now, despite the fact that there's been this gap and this kind of loss of knowledge and familial knowledge possibly, is the fact that we have, like, for example, we've got Instagram now, and we've got YouTube, and we've got some other methods of sharing techniques and advice and tutorials. Yeah. So that is a positive, I guess.
Yeah, and gardening too. Like, I used to always teach composting with a cooperative extension. That's sort of agricultural teaching in the U.S. And it showed all different ways of composting in containers. And then we'd have a Q&A, and in the audience, and is adult education that was the umbrella. And there would be people who'd done a lot of composting and people who hadn't even started yet and were a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
And you have the most wonderful Q&A, question and answer, with people bringing things up, and then the different experiences that people had. I just loved it. It's a wonderful way of teaching. So you can use a little YouTube about something, and then you can have examples of it maybe to pass around and handouts. And then you have question and answer, and it just gets richer and richer because people have more questions and other people have more answers.
Yeah.
And you're right. Those YouTubes, those Instagram things, they're wonderful for teaching.
Yeah, I've learned so much from people who literally live in different countries, that I will probably never get to meet in the flesh, sadly, but we still are able to connect.
Well, yeah, and you're spreading, like, you can tell people about the good ones too. So
absolutely. Well, that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast, exactly.
Yeah, I know. That's why my granddaughter was so excited, what you're doing.
Yeah, she's been amazing. She's been fantastic. Beedy, I've taken so much of your time, and I'm so grateful. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about or mention before we wrap up?
God, I can't believe we covered an awful lot. I think it's enough.
Thank you so much for your time, Beedy.
Yeah, I hope this works. It's fun for me. I mean, you say, how do I feel? I feel just thrilled that these things are being reborn.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!